Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Lech Lecha. We're in the third portion, and this is all so important. These first three portions give us such a background of history and the whole salvation story, really. So this week's portion in Lech Lecha is Genesis 12:1 through 17:27. I don't have my real reading glasses on today, so please excuse. The Haftarah is Isaiah 40, verse 27 through 41, verse 16. And the New Covenant portion is Romans 4, 1 through 25. So what we saw in Bereshit, the first portion, God created the world and he made everything wonderful and beautiful. We saw that sin came into the world. And then in chapter 6 of Genesis, which was still in that first portion, Bereshit, we saw the Nephilim entered into the earth, and that brought us right into the portion, the second portion, Noach, the story of Noah. And when we start that story, that portion of Noach in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11, it says in Hebrew, ותשחט הארץ לפני האלוהים ותמלא הארץ חמס. It says, now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And you just heard that word Hamas right here. And so it was, the world was in need of a restart. And that was what God did with Noah when he sent that rain and he destroyed the wickedness that was in the earth. And Noah came out of the ark to a beautiful and a new start. But when we got to the end of that portion last week, still in Noah, we saw all mankind coming together to build the Tower of Babel once again. We saw men rising up to rebel against God. And so in this week's portion, Lech Lecha, we get a whole new start because God chooses a man through which he will bring the Messiah and through which he will bless the whole earth. So a few things I would like you, as you're reading through this portion, because it's also another large portion, things to really pay attention to are how God relates with Avraham, or his name still is Avram right here at the beginning, but it says things like the Lord said, the Lord appeared, the word of the Lord came to Avram in a vision, God talked with him. Also pay attention to places, names of places. There are so many in this portion, to altars and to the covenant that is talked about several times here. And so just very quickly, we'll hit on some highlights going through here, but starting in the portion Lech Lecha in Genesis chapter 12, I'll start right in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Avram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And right there we have another messianic prophecy, another prophecy of Messiah who is going to come through Abraham, and through him the whole earth, Gentiles and Jews, will be blessed. So it's going on in verse 4. Avram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Avram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Avram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. So we get through that, and it just talks about his travels, and then it says in verse 8, and then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. So this is where we see Abraham calling on the Lord, and this beautiful relationship that opens up between Abraham and God. So there's a lot of stories. The next thing that we see is that there's a famine in the land. Abraham goes down to Egypt, and he tells his wife, listen, you're so beautiful. Tell everybody that you're my sister and not my wife. And so she obeys him. She does that. But look what it says in chapter 12, verse 17. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. And then Pharaoh called Abram and he said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. We go on into chapter 13 and we see that God blessed Abram and he became rich. He became rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And also Lot, his possessions increased, and they increased so much that it says that there was strife between Abraham's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen. And Abram said, please don't let there be any strife between me and you. You pick where you want to go and I'll go the other way. And this is such a beautiful a principle. It's something that we had a staff meeting yesterday, and we just spoke about how at all costs that we will keep strife out of our life and out of our relationships. So that's what they did. They split up, and we know that Lot ended up going into that beautiful valley, which was really in the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in chapter 13, verse 18, Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And like I said, just keep your eye on where we are, all the places that are there. In chapter 14, there's that war between all of those kings. And we see in verse 12, they also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions, and they departed, for he was living in Sodom. So already here in warfare, we see, just as we experience now, this issue of the taking of hostages. But Abram got his men together and he went back and he fought. And it says in verse 16 of chapter 14, he brought back all the goods and brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. He brought them all home. Another interesting thing that happens right here is we see the appearance of Melchizedek, also Melchizedek, I think his name is. And many people think that this is like an early appearance of the Messiah Yeshua before he actually came in flesh. In verse 17, it says, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him. He blessed Abram, and he said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tenth of all. And that's one of our clues, that we see Abraham worshiping him by giving him a tenth of all. When we get into chapter 15, that first verse says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. And your reward will be very great. And really, it's at this point that God promises Abram that he's going to have an heir. And basically, Abram's, saying, how is this going to happen? Because, I am old and Sarah is old. And so when we get into verse 7, he said, meaning God, he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. And that's really our first promise right there, that God was going to give this land to Abraham and his descendants that would ultimately come through his son Isaac. So also when we get back going down still in chapter 15, the middle of verse 17, it says, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kerizzite, and the Kadmonite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Yebusite. And so then we get into chapter 16, and it starts off by saying, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. And we know how this story goes. This was an idea that came from Sarah. God never told them to do it. But Sarah gave her maid into Abraham's arms. And through that union came a child named Ishmael. And of course, as soon as Hagar had Ishmael, she didn't act toward Sarah with the same respect that she had before. And so Sarah, who was her mistress, treated her very harshly. And they ended up sending Hagar out into the wilderness. And Hagar put her child down and she just placed him to die. And she walked away from him because she didn't want to watch her son die. But then we see that the angel of the Lord meets her and he speaks to her and he says, "You are with child and you will bear a son and you shall call his name Ishmael because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all of his brothers." Then Hagar called on the name of the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees." That's what she called him. And in Hebrew, it is El Roi with an Aleph and not an Ein. El Roi with the Ein is the Lord my shepherd, but this is the God who sees me. And that's the first time that we see God referred to with this name. When we get into chapter 17, it says, "Now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, 'I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you.'" And here God is talking about covenant with him. "And I will multiply you exceedingly." Abram fell on his face and God talked with him. "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham." And as we see many times with God, we see God now changing someone's name. He changes his name from exalted father, Avram, to Abraham, like the father of multitudes. He goes on and then he says in verse 10, this is still in chapter 17, "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you must be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of covenant between me and you." So at this point, this is where we see that God gives a sign of the covenant between himself and his covenant people, which are going to come from Abraham. And that would be the line of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who to this day use the sign of the covenant, circumcision, to be set apart unto the Lord as a way of saying that you're our God and we are your people. In verse 15 of chapter 17, God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her, and then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her." And Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." But God said, "No, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Yitzchak," or Isaac. "And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant." So here we see that the covenant between God, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov was going to be an everlasting covenant. And that brings us into our next portion, Vayera. And, but I wanted to read also, because we talked about El Roi, the God who sees. And so I really wanted to finish in the Haftarah. And so if we look in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 27, this is what's written there. And it says, "Why do you say, O Yaakov, and assert, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of my God?" God's saying here, Why do you say that I can't see you? Why do you say that I don't know what's happening with you? And that directly relates to what we saw with Hagar calling him Adonai Roi, the God who sees. So for each one of us today, whatever our circumstance is, whatever seems impossible, whatever we've been seeking him for it, and maybe saying to him, don't you see me? Don't you hear me? The answer is he is Adonai Roi. He's the God who sees. And with that knowledge, be blessed and have a wonderful day. Shalom.